And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our museum educator, Dr. John Maass.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight for a discussion on the U.S. Army in the Philippines with Chris Kolakowski. I'm glad you're with us for our program called Battle Briefs. We do about 10 of these a year. We've got them lined up for the next several months, so we'll be posting that on our website, for the National Museum's website. And we hope to have you for that, for our book talks and lots of other programs that we have going on. So please check out our website. We'll post that at the end, or I'll have Jen put that in the chat so you can see what our website is and just go under events. So we're very pleased to have a friend of mine for about 10 years, Chris Kolakowski. I want to talk a little bit about him. Chris is currently the director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum in Madison, Wisconsin. Before that, directly related to our subject tonight, he was the director of the MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia. And before that, he was an Army guy in the Army Museum System and was the director of the Patton Museum at Fort Knox, Kentucky. So welcome, Chris. We're glad to have you with us tonight, and a very good evening to you, sir.
Thanks for having me, John. It's always great to talk history with you.
Good, good. Well, Chris, to let folks know a little bit more about you, can you tell us about your publications that you've had on the Philippines and specifically?
Back in 2016, I published a book called Last Stand on Bataan, and it's a military history of the defense of the Philippines from December 41 to May of 42. And there'd been some records that had been come out since some of the last popular campaign histories. And I was really able to mine some of those sources. And I'm really pleased with how that book came out.
Good, great. Now, rumor has it that you were a Civil War guy before that, and I know you've got some publications about the Civil War. What are your titles that you have on the Civil War?
I've done three. I've done the Civil War at Perryville, which is the history of the Kentucky campaign of 1862. And then I wrote the sequel, the Stones River and Tullahoma campaigns, which followed the Army's back into Middle Tennessee, December 1862, and then the summer of 1863. And then as part of the Army Sesquicentennial series, I did the Virginia campaigns of 1862. I did the volume on that, which is the Valley of 1862 campaign, Peninsula, and also Second Manassas or Second Bull Run, depending on your point of view.
Great. Well, we're glad to have you with us. And tonight we're going to focus on the Philippines, your work, and the Army in the Philippines in general. So for those folks who aren't familiar with this topic, Chris, how long has the Army, or was the Army, involved in some way, shape, or form in the Philippines, and how did that get started?
The Army comes to the Philippines really as part of the war with Spain in 1898. The Philippines had been a Spanish possession since the 1500s, and it very quickly becomes a battlefront, particularly after Commodore Dewey wins, or Admiral Dewey wins the Battle of Manila Bay, May 1st, 1898. That spurs the dispatch of an expeditionary force to basically end Spanish rule there, just like what we're doing in Puerto Rico, just like what we do in Cuba. From that point, the Army will stay and will have a formal presence in terms of installation, in terms of major commands, right up until 1947. And even then, after that, a lot of soldiers will go through the Philippines, either on R&R or go back and forth through Vietnam, or through the Philippines on their way to and from Vietnam. And there will be some Army units, small Army units stationed there right up until the U.S. bases closed in 1991. The reason I break at 1947 is because after World War II, the Army as an institution leaves. It turns over one of its major bases, Fort McKinley, right outside of the capital of Manila, over to the Philippine Army. It's now known as Fort Bonifacio. And the rest of the military posts that aren't U.S. Navy already, like Cavite and Subic Bay, get turned over to the Air Force. And so like Clark Air Base, Camp John Hay, Fort Stotzenburg all become Air Force installations. They still have an Army presence, but as an institution, the Army's gone. But still, that's a long time when you think about it, 1898 to 1947, and the transformation and just the incredible events that the Army is a part of in the Philippine Islands.
And as you mentioned, the Spanish-American War was really the beginning of the involvement. What did the Army do in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, and how important was that?
Oh, it was very important. The Filipinos had actually risen up against the Spanish at this point, and some Filipinos will argue this is the first Philippine Republic. And basically, they've tried a couple times, they've risen up against the Spanish. With Dewey's fleet, they have actually besieged Manila and are fighting the Spanish all over the islands. When the American Expeditionary Force arrives, July, August timeframe, they join the siege of Manila, force the Spanish in Manila to surrender and start securing the islands and helping the Filipinos secure the islands. So by the time those peace is signed in December of 1898, the Spanish have no more claim to the islands, and they actually sign the islands over to the United States.
So what do we hear when we're talking about the Philippine Insurrection? That was a post-war movement for Philippine independence. And what can you tell us about that, and how long did it last?
Absolutely. The insurrection, which is known in the Philippines as the Philippine War, starts in February of 1899 when the to give it very quickly, the Filipinos realize that they have not been granted their independence at the end when Spain leaves, that the United States is going to be the new colonizer. And for many Filipinos, that means you're just trading one overlord for another. And so in 1899, under the leadership of a man named Emilio Aguinaldo, who's only 30 at the time, there's fighting that starts in Manila. Tensions are rising. Fighting starts, some skirmishing here and there. And that's basically the flame, if you will, on the dry kindling. And then basically from 1899, really until 1902, the United States and the Filipinos fight some at times very savage campaigns all over the archipelago, which we're talking 7,100 islands. So you've got it's the major U.S. Army overseas commitment. And they go all over the place. In fact, Frederick Funston, who's a name looms very large in the Army pre-1917, leads a commando raid and goes and captures Aguinaldo in 1901. Most people think that's going to end the war. Well, the Filipinos keep fighting really until 1902. And then, even then, in the southern parts of the islands, particularly in Mindanao, the Muslim Moro population, which are still an insurgent today, still fellow travelers with groups like Al-Qaeda and things like that, they'll actually fight the Americans until 1913. So it's a long period. And it's interesting though, because after the insurrection's over, after the Philippine War is over, and I'll quote the first Filipino graduate of West Point, Vicente Lim. He wrote in a paper when he came and attended the Command and General Staff College in the 20s. He said that the Filipinos the Americans gave them everything that they thought that they were fighting for in the years after the insurrection: self-government, education, the right to have their own economy. They were no longer being exploited for the mother country. And that's something that the United States, even as early as 1916, is already giving the Filipinos government. It's always the idea that eventually the Philippines will be independent, but for a variety of reasons, most of them strategic because of the Philippines' position in the Far East, we're going to hang on to the Philippines and begin to fortify the place, which may be getting a little ahead of the discussion, but all of this starts with the Philippine insurrection.
Now, I understand that there was a famous American general or future general that was also involved in the Philippines in 1913, or around that time? Who was that?
You talk about John Pershing, and this actually was Pershing's second tour in the Philippines. He had been there 1904, 1905, having fought in Cuba in the Spanish-American War in Cuba, and had ended up there and helped subdue the Moros. And it's actually as a case study in counterinsurgency and understanding the culture of your adversary. Pershing offers a really interesting case study in how successful that is. He had to fight battles. He tried to not fight when he could, but sometimes he did fight. He did have to fight. And interestingly, it's during this time they realized that the American sidearm, officer's sidearm, the 32, that's standard issue, can't penetrate the Moro leather armor with enough stopping power. So that's shortly thereafter is when they developed the 45, the famous M1911 45, as a side note. He leaves, comes back and serves again from 1911 to 1913 and basically finishes what he started a few years before. The Moros thought so highly of him that he, to this day, is the only non-white chief they have ever anointed. The term is Datu, and he's the only, I missaid that, he's the only non-native Datu that they have ever anointed. So that says a great deal about his ability to take care of that insurgency.
Sure. Okay, so let's move a little bit farther along the timeline. The Army stayed in the Philippines. What were they doing in the Philippines as far as using it strategically? What made Washington, the authorities in Washington, decide to maintain a presence in the Philippines?
The big reason is what's going on in Asia at the time. Remember too, when the Army shows up in the Philippines in 1898, 2 years later is the Boxer Rebellion. There's conflicts in Korea. You've got Japanese expansion that's already happening. They annexed Korea in 1910. They had annexed Formosa, modern Taiwan, in 1895. Russo-Japanese War, 1904, 1905, and its results are changing the balance of power in Asia. And the United States realizes this is an important part of the world. And both in terms of economics, but also just the population, resources, many things. And so the idea of having an American outpost on the Pacific Rim in the Western Pacific is a good idea. And that's why they hang on to the Philippines. And they begin to fortify the Philippines. They establish, as I mentioned earlier, Fort McKinley outside of Manila, Fort Stotsenburg, which will later be put next to Clark Air Base in the central Philippines, the central part of the main island of Luzon, Camp John Hay in the northern mountains, and then they begin to fortify the islands in Manila Bay. And that's Corregidor being the most famous one, which is known to the Army as Fort Mills. The Navy establishes, of course, Subic Bay, also Cavite in Manila Bay. So it becomes very quickly an American outpost, literally around the world from the continental United States.
So by the time that in the years right before American involvement in World War II, were American forces welcomed by the Filipinos, or was this seen as an occupation?
American forces were welcome. The giving the Filipinos progressive self-government had really done a lot. One of the big things, though, is in 1934, an act called the Tydings-McDuffie Act had been passed and had given the Filipinos, had promised them independence in 10 years. Ultimately, it would be 12 years because that gets overtaken by events, obviously, World War II. And so the Filipinos were electing a Commonwealth government. They basically enjoyed a legal status from 1935 until 1946, the islands did, as comparable to Puerto Rico today. They were a Commonwealth associated with the United States, but they were not a state. And they'd elected a president named Manuel Quezon, who had long been advocate for Philippine independence, in many ways is probably, I would argue, the George Washington of the Philippines. And he realizes in preparation for independence that he needs a good armed forces. He needs a good Army, Navy, Air Force. And he hires as military advisor, basically the person that can build this and can work with the United States to get equipment, get whatever's, what's necessary to build the armed forces. He hires the outgoing Army Chief of Staff, General Douglas MacArthur. And so in 1935, MacArthur goes out to the Philippines and basically spends the next 6 years of his life until World War II starts, trying to build a Philippine armed forces and trying to prepare the Philippines for, for independence. And of course, this is also occurring in the rising background of increased Japanese aggression. Of course, the Marco Polo Bridge incident that starts the war in China in 1937. It's, in fact, to quote General Lim again, and I use this in one of the, to start my first chapter of my Bataan book. He writes to his wife in 1940. She's on vacation, and he says the war is practically on in Asia. So that's that ever increasing temperature, geopolitical temperature in Asia is a backdrop for everything MacArthur and Kazan are working on.
So as we get closer to the outbreak of World War II, well, not the outbreak, but the involvement of the U.S. in World War II, the Army is still in the Philippines. From what you told me earlier, a number of World War II generals had seen prior service in the Philippines. Is that right?
That's right. The Philippines, much like today, most people in their Army careers will end up either in Germany or Korea for at least one tour, if not multiple tours. That was the Philippine Islands for the Army before 1941. There are quite a few generals that do at least one, if not more than one tour. Douglas MacArthur, that was the fourth time he'd been to the Philippines. Dwight Eisenhower was one of his staff officers. Of course, we've already talked about John Pershing. People like Jonathan Wainwright, Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., to name just a few that are rolling off the top of my head, all did multiple tours in the Philippines. So it's a real overseas proving ground. Again, much like Germany or Korea would be today, or maybe the Middle East of the Army of the last 15 or 20 years. And so it's a real proving ground. There's a lot of people that know the islands. George Marshall, who's the Army Chief of Staff in 1941, had been to the Philippines a couple times, and knew when the war is getting close, knew the importance, understood it because he'd been there, he'd lived it. It's a real proving ground and a real important stop in most every Army senior leader's biography of World War II.
So again, as we get closer toward American warfare in the Pacific, who were the Philippine Scouts? I've heard that a number of times. We've got some artifacts in the National Museum about them. Can you tell us a little bit more about that unit?
Absolutely. And if you want, while I'm at it, I'll just give a quick rundown of the U.S. Army presence in the summer of '41 in the Philippines, because of which the Scouts are the major part. The Philippine Scouts were recruited actually during the Philippine War and its immediate aftermath, and they were modeled originally after the Indian Scouts of the Indian Wars. And so you've got Filipinos who are enlisted into the United States Army. And they were eventually grouped into their own units with mostly white officers. There were Filipinos, starting with General Lim, and then others that attended West Point, but with mostly white officers. The 45th, 57th Regiments of Infantry, 23rd, 24th, and 88th Regiments of Artillery, and the 26th Regiment of Cavalry. And these, in the early part of the 20s, were organized into the Philippine Division, much like the garrison of Hawaii became known as the Hawaiian Division, and augmented by the 31st U.S. Infantry. And so they are the backbone of the Army presence in the Philippines. There's about 10,000 of them there in the summer of 1941, mostly organized into the Philippine Division, but with some other units as well in the Philippine Department. And they'll provide cadres to the expanding Philippine Army, because as the war clouds gather, one of the things that the Army will do is they'll first of all recall MacArthur to the colors and create U.S. Army forces far east. But the Philippine Army, which has slowly been mobilizing and will only be about 50% mobilized when the war starts in December 1941, Some of their cadres and definitely their trainers are coming from the Philippine division, the Philippine Scouts. And then the Philippine division and the units of the Philippine division, I argue, are the backbone of the defense of the Philippines on Bataan, particularly on Bataan, but also to a certain extent on Corregidor as well. They are outstanding fighters. And if you want to know anything about what a well-equipped, well-trained Filipino soldier is capable of, the Philippine Scouts are the best example I can come up with.
Mm. So, Chris, I'm not very familiar with the Pacific Theater in the Philippines, but I have a general idea. And I guess folks like me, the one thing we do know about the Philippines in the World War II era is it had something to do with MacArthur. And the MacArthur's, Douglas and his father, it seems like the family has a very deep and long-term relationship with the Philippines. Can you fill us in on that?
Absolutely. The MacArthur connection to the Philippines actually starts in 1898 because one of the senior commanders of that expeditionary force that goes to Manila is Arthur MacArthur, who was Douglas's father, Medal of Honor recipient from the Civil War. He sticks around, fights in the first stages of the Philippine insurrections, actually military governor of the islands for about a year and a half before he gives over to William Howard Taft. He's long associated with the Philippines, realizes very quickly that the Far East is a place the United States needs to be in. And he will later be an advisor or an observer to the Russo-Japanese War, and will take his son Douglas with him on a tour of the Far East, and will inculcate this view to Douglas. In fact, Douglas had gotten there. He graduated from West Point in 1903. His first duty station was building docks and ports on the island of Leyte in the central Philippines. So he's already sort of been bitten by the Philippine bug. And to a certain generation, if you're in Manuel Quezon or General Lim's generation, Douglas is actually MacArthur the younger, as opposed to his father, MacArthur the elder. But Douglas, as I mentioned, has been there several times. He and Quezon, as Quezon will refer to it, they are muchachos. In fact, MacArthur, when Douglas has his son, or his wife Jean, he and his wife Jean have their son. The Quezons, Manuel and his wife Donna Aurora, are the godparents, which is an interesting thing when you think about it. In 1937, to have non-white godparents and that's, I'll leave the audience to unpack that as they want, but I think it's a significant statement. But yeah, Douglas MacArthur is a huge figure in the Philippines. And even today, when you go there, there's MacArthur Highway, his suite in the Manila Hotel is still preserved. When I went there in 2013, I was wearing my MacArthur Memorial hat, and the guy at customs in the Manila airport stopped and talked to me for about 10 minutes because he loved MacArthur and was really interested in in where the memorial was and wanted to talk some history and what was I doing here. It was just a great conversation. So he's a part of the Philippines then, now, and well into the future, I'm sure.
So you don't anticipate him fading away in the Philippines?
No, he definitely will not.
Okay, good. So Pearl Harbor comes December 7th, 1941. Where does that leave the Philippines? We have an Army presence there, a Navy presence, Army air assets. What's the theory? What's the thinking back in Washington about what to do with the Philippines?
The pre-war plan always assumed that the Pacific Fleet would have to fight its way across the Pacific to relieve the Philippines. It's kind of like the British in Singapore. Hold out until an expeditionary force can get across to you. MacArthur had wanted to defend the islands on the beaches. He was in the middle of implementing that strategy. As a matter of fact, that new strategy was approved December 1st, 1941. The old plan had assumed that you fall back to Bataan Peninsula and Corregidor Island at the mouth of Manila Bay and then hold out for 5 months, because by then the Navy would get across. Nobody in Washington is willing to admit it, but for all intents and purposes, when the Pacific Fleet's battleships go to the bottom of the Pearl Harbor, the relief for the Philippines from Hawaii, that's not going to happen. The only option is that at that point is anything coming up from Singapore or the Netherlands, East Indies, and they have problems of their own because they're getting attacked at the same time. The Philippines is going to give a good account of themselves. The defenders of the Philippines are going to do good work. Even so, the war for them starts early on because of the time difference. It's the early morning hours of December 8th. And so for the people in the Philippines, most of them, it's a ringing telephone or a radio is how the war starts, including MacArthur. They expect Japanese air raids from Formosa, and I'm greatly simplifying this. This is always one of the great controversies of the war in the Pacific is why did MacArthur's Air Force get caught on the ground 9 hours after Pearl Harbor? Well, originally there was some discussion about sending the small force of B-17s, 35 of them against Formosa, where they would have run into several hundred Japanese fighters and probably not come home. So they're watching for the Japanese. There's fog in Formosa, which delays the Japanese from approaching. But false alarms get the airplanes in the air that morning anyway. They're running out of fuel. They land just before lunchtime. And the point I always make to people is, where's the war? Kind of like most of the United States on 9/11, unless you lived in New York or Washington, it was a news event. It was something that was happening somewhere else. The world around you looked normal, just like it had the day before. That's the same thing with these airmen. And so they park their planes at Clark Field and elsewhere, and then they go have lunch, just like they would on any other day. And at that point is when the Japanese air shows up and catches half and destroys half of them on the ground and knocks out one of the major props of defense. And then after that, it's just a matter of trying to fight a ground battle when the Japanese control the air and the sea around the islands. And ultimately, those prove to be disadvantages that are not able to be overcome.
Right. Well, before we get into more of the actual fighting in the Philippines, can you, having been there yourself, can you tell us a little bit about the terrain that was involved in fighting in the Philippines for both sides?
It depends on where you are. The Philippines are products of volcanoes and undersea mountains that have popped up. And so the terrain in many places is very mountainous, particularly northern Luzon, the central Visayan Islands, where you've got big central peaks in the center, surrounded by plains and coastal plains, things like that. There's a big central Luzon plain that's pretty fertile. It's about 100 miles long by about 80 miles wide, I believe it is, or thereabouts. And then a lot of the other area, though, is rugged and jungle filled. It is particularly, that's one of the reasons that they chose Bataan for where they were going to fight, was because it was such excellent defensive terrain, and it could provided good cover and concealment for an army to hold out there. It's tropical. The climate is, the best way I can tell you is the climate feels like Virginia in June, July, and August, for those of you who are familiar. When I used to live in Norfolk, I'd refer to some of those days in June and July as Philippine weather. There is a dry season in basically November through May, and then there is a monsoon, although not as bad as on the mainland of Asia, for the rest of the year. So they're tropical islands, for sure.
Okay, well, without me interrupting you, why don't we take the next 10 minutes and talk us through Bataan and Corregidor, through Manila and the end of the war, and then we'll move on to some images and questions. And but take some time and give us kind of the Army's role in the Bataan and Corregidor surrender, and then the efforts to reclaim the islands in 44 and 45.
Absolutely, sure. Bataan and Corregidor, let me just throw a couple of facts at people that they may not be aware of. Bataan and Corregidor, which is basically December 1941 until Corregidor is surrendered May 6th, 1942, is the largest Army battle since 1918 when it's fought. The liberation of the Philippines in 1944 and 45 is the largest army operation of the Pacific War, and it is second largest army commitment in the entire Second World War, except for the only exception to that being the advance from Normandy to Central Europe. So what happens in the Philippines are major events for the United States Army. Let's start with Bataan and Corregidor. MacArthur trying to defend on the beaches when the Japanese land on December 22nd, northwest of Manila, and then southeast of Manila on Christmas Eve, very quickly realizes that's not going to be possible and orders a retreat back to Bataan and Corregidor to activate the old plan, which will be done. But because they've had to make different logistical arrangements, and because the half-trained Philippine Army troops can't hold as long as they need to, instead of a 2-week withdrawal, it's a 1-week withdrawal. So the Bataan garrison of basically 80,000 Americans and Filipinos has to go on half rations when they finally complete the withdrawal in January of 1942. By the time the surrender happens on April 9th, most of these men will be living on less than 1,000 calories a day. It's a lesson in endurance and it's difficult to explain the conditions under which that battle was fought. It's some of the worst that the Army had endured up to that time. But I will say this, they also win the first tactical ground victory by Western troops against the Japanese in the war. The Japanese pushed them halfway down the peninsula and then and basically throw everything in for the kill in February. And in very hard fighting along the coast and in the central part of Bataan, the Americans actually stopped the Japanese. The Americans and Filipinos actually stopped the Japanese and forced them to send heavy reinforcements to the Philippines. This is the only place in those early first 6 months campaigns of the Pacific War that Allied forces taste that kind of victory. And so it's a huge moment. It also makes the defenders of Bataan and Corregidor a symbol of Allied resistance. But victories elsewhere make them an increasingly isolated outpost behind Japanese lines. Question now becomes, what happens to Douglas MacArthur and Manuel Quezon? And particularly MacArthur, who the Japanese have promised to hang as a war criminal in downtown Tokyo. And so the President of the United States, partly because of domestic pressure, but significantly because the Prime Minister of Australia requests a senior American general to help defend that continent, orders MacArthur to leave the Philippines. And that's an interesting leadership case study that I use sometimes about duty, putting the mission first. What happens when the President of the United States changes your mission and changes your duty? MacArthur didn't want to go. He wanted to stay, fight it out as a private. In fact, he said that. His staff told him, talked him out of it, said, "You're nuts. You're the only person that can command the resources necessary to get back before the food runs out." And so MacArthur, it's one of the great adventure stories in American military history. March 11th through the 17th, 1942, goes to Australia. Of course, makes the famous statement there, "I shall return." The army that he leaves behind surrenders, is the victim of a final Japanese attack on Good Friday in April of 1942. April 9th, 1942, 77 years after Appomattox, the 76,000 defenders of Bataan surrender. And that begins what many people probably have heard of when you think of Bataan, the Bataan Death March, one of the great atrocities of the Pacific War. Corregidor holds out for another month, and then General Jonathan Wainwright surrenders Corregidor and the rest of the Philippines in May of 1942. And for all intents and purposes, the darkness of occupation comes over the islands. But the light of Allied resistance has not been extinguished. In fact, the Filipinos, aided by some escaped officers from the Philippine Scouts and from other US units, will organize the largest anti-Axis resistance movement in the war, in the Pacific, and second in the war only to the Polish Home Army. Poles had 400,000 in the Polish Home Army. There was 250,000 Filipinos in the guerrilla movement. And by the end, they will be so capable that they will be able to assist regular conventional US forces and fight conventional battles, and in several cases, liberate entire provinces on their own. Meanwhile, MacArthur, organizing in Australia, begins to fight his way back. A series of campaigns. That may be a whole other conversation for a whole other time, John. And in October 1944, October 20th, 1944, MacArthur keeps his promise to come back to the Philippines and wades ashore at Leyte. 3 days later, restoring the Philippine government in the temporary capital of Tacloban, which those of you who are familiar with Imelda Marcos, she was 16 years old and was in the crowd watching that ceremony. And of course, later her husband, Ferdinand, would be president of the Philippines for many years. And then in a series of campaigns throughout the rest of 44, and then starting in January 45 with the landing on the main island of Luzon, advanced to Manila, liberation of Bataan and Corregidor, and then a series of amphibious invasions in the central and southern part of the Philippines, 38 invasions in 44 days at one point by the U.S. 8th Army, will liberate the bulk of the islands by the end of the war. And the war's end, the Japanese are still holding out a little bit in the hills. But when the Japan surrenders, their overall commander, General Yamashita, will walk out of the hills and will surrender to the Americans. And so that in about 7.5 minutes, John, is World War II in the Philippines. I do want to make one other point about relevance real quick, because knowing you've probably got a couple of questions you want to delve deeper into. The fact that the United States, alone among all the colonial powers, got back to liberate the colonies, in other words, kept MacArthur's promise, is geopolitical and is of geopolitical importance today in Asia. It's a big reason why the United States is a trusted partner and ally of so many countries in Asia today. And I made that comment at the MacArthur Memorial about 2 years ago on a tour giving to the ambassador of the People's Republic of Vietnam, which, as you know, the United States and Vietnam have not always had the best relationship. But when I said that to him, he nodded emphatically and absolutely agreed with that. So even though this is 75, 76 years in the past, it's like yesterday out there. And it still influences our position in Asia today.
Let me ask one follow-up question to the war years there. Tell us briefly about the nature of the fighting in Manila and what made that really brutal, and what effects does that still have today?
Manila is the largest urban battle of the Pacific War and one of the larger urban battles of the entire Second World War. The Japanese, General Yamashita, who had commanded the entire Philippine forces, he didn't have complete control over the Navy. They had a more divided system of command, the Japanese did, than the Americans. He orders the evacuation of Manila and evacuates virtually all the Japanese army forces out of Manila. He's going to declare it an open city, just like MacArthur had in 1941. But the Japanese admiral commanding the area right there, a guy named Iwabuchi Sanji, had survived a couple of years before the sinking of his battleship off Guadalcanal. In the Japanese Navy, that's a disgrace because captains go down with the ship in the Japanese Navy. So he's looking for a way to redeem himself. And I'm simplifying a little bit, but he's looking for a way to redeem himself. And one of the ways to do it is to defend Manila, destroy Manila as a port, render it useless to the United States, and in the process, take as many Americans and Filipinos as he can with him. And so that's the genesis of the Battle of Manila. When the Americans show up, both from north and south, 11th Airborne from the south, 1st Cavalry and 37th Infantry from the north, they secure the northern parts of the city, and then get in for basically a month, from February 3rd to March 3rd, get into a month's worth of house-to-house fighting, literally room to room. If you see the pictures, it looks just like Warsaw. It looks just like Stalingrad. It was on a fighting of that ferocity. And on top of it, the Japanese had been instructed that the Filipino civilians were to be regarded as potential guerrillas and be treated accordingly. And so of the 600,000 people that were living in Manila at the time, over 100,000 were massacred in the course of the battle. And some of them, particularly the women, had endured rape, had endured many things, torture, many instances of considerable brutality before they were ultimately murdered. And at the end, almost all the 16,000 Japanese died to a person, and there were about 3,000 American casualties during that period. MacArthur forbade airstrikes to try and limit the damage, but at the end, he had to use artillery. The city has never fully recovered. It was the most destroyed Allied city of the war, with the exception of Warsaw, Poland. And even today, the infrastructure, you can still see some of the destruction. The infrastructure has never fully recovered. If you see pictures of pre-war Manila, it's a different city than what it is now. Manila in 1941 was the Pearl of the Orient. It was one of the commercial hubs. It was one of the great commercial centers and cultural centers of the Far East. It lost that mantle because of World War II. And I would argue Hong Kong was the city that really picked it up. Hong Kong and Singapore picked up that mantle. And that transition is a direct result of the war.
Sure, great. Okay, Chris, we're going to move into a couple artifact images that come from the National Museum of the U.S. Army. So we'll get those, the first one up here so we can see here. Can you tell us about the insurgent army axe that was a Filipino insurgent? What makes this special in your mind?
This one and the next one are great examples of what the Filipinos, particularly the Moro people in the southern Philippines, were fighting the Americans with. This is a culture that has had a warrior tradition for a very long time. And one of the things I'll point out to you, that's a handmade weapon. It's a hand-forged weapon. Some of these weapons, particularly the kris that you'll see on the next slide, were family heirlooms and would be passed down from generation to generation. And one of the things I'd point out to you on this blade is I'd point out the intricacy of the blade, particularly in the very left-hand side, where you can stab, you can slash, but it's also got that little prong sticking out from it that enables you to both capture, cut, and hack. So this weapon may look like a simple sword, but it's actually a very versatile weapon.
All right, let's move on to the next one then.
Sure.
Another insurgent weapon that U.S. troops faced when they were in the Philippines during that time after the Spanish-American War, with a very interesting curved blade.
That's right. And if you count the curves, if even-numbered curves odd-numbered curves are considered cursed. This one has an even-numbered. But again, I direct your attention to the craftsmanship, particularly around the hilt and some of the carving of the blade. These are people that would fight. They'd fight well, and they did fight well. And they were very proud people. And anybody that has been around Filipinos or has dealt with Filipinos know that they are a great people, and they are very proud. And they have many good reasons to do. This and the previous one are good examples of how you can learn a lot from your opponents just by studying their material culture.
All right, let's move on to the next one if we can. This is the Philippine Insurrection Medal from 1899. Who was awarded these medals, Chris?
These are some of the first campaign medals, and some of these are awarded retroactively to guys who are finally get them in the 19-teens. But this is anybody that was in the islands from 1899 to, I believe it's 1905. So Pershing would have been awarded one of these. Arthur MacArthur would have been awarded one of these. So would Douglas MacArthur.
Okay, thanks. All right, let's move on to the next one here. Tell us about the Senabari.
This is a deeply spiritual garment for a Japanese soldier. The Senabari is the 1,000-stitch belt. And if you look very carefully, you can see in the belt, particularly among the characters, the different stitches. A soldier was supposed to go around to his hometown and get women to put one stitch in there. And the idea was when you went to battle, you wore this in battle. It was supposed to give you spiritual protection, but it was also as if you were carrying through those stitches the expectations and the support of your entire town with you. They're usually worn around the waist. And a lot of American soldiers would take these off of Japanese bodies as souvenirs, as I presume this one is here. And I would presume some of the dark stain may be the wearer's blood. But when you look at the culture of the Japanese private soldier, this is a very strong indicator of that culture.
All right, and the next one, we'll move on to the M1 Garand rifle, World War II staple. Is there a special relationship to the M1 Garand with the Philippines?
There is. A lot of people don't realize that just before the war, the Philippine Scouts and the 31st Infantry were equipped with early versions of the M1 Garand. And so that's actually the first combat use of the Garand against the Axis in World War II, is on Bataan and Corregidor. And the lessons from the Garand and some of the other weapon systems that are being used for the first time in World War II were transported out of the Philippines, and those lessons were used to develop later versions or to influence American training back in the United States. And so, yeah, that's, most people don't realize it was used that early, but yeah, the Garand was speaking its voice on Bataan and Corregidor, and then of course during the liberation.
All right, I'm going to move into some questions. Let's leave this screen up with the Garand while we talk a little bit more. Was MacArthur, and these are from our listeners or our audience tonight,
Okay.
was MacArthur permitted to remain part of the U.S. Army and also lead the Philippine Army?
For 2 years, from 1935 to 37, he was part of the U.S. Army. Then he had to retire. It was basically, we're either come home from the Philippines or we are going, or you have to retire. And so he retired. He was actually also appointed Field Marshal of the Philippine Army. So he's the only American to ever hold the rank of Field Marshal. So he's out of the Army. He's completely out of the Army. In fact, in May of 1941, he writes to General Marshall and says, is there something, is there a possibility that I might have a position in Asia? If because things are heating up. And Marshall said, otherwise I'm coming home, he says. And Marshall said, you just stay put. We've got you in mind. We haven't forgotten you. And then in July 26, 1941, he's recalled to the colors. And of course will be on active duty until his death. But there is that interlude of retirement.
Okay, one of our audience members is interested in knowing about and I'm sure I'm mispronouncing this, but the Balangiga massacre? Is that?
The Balangiga.
Yes, they want to know about that. And is that one of the more famous incidents or actions of the war?
I'd say infamous, but yes. And particularly, of course, the return of the bells from the church a few years ago. Basically, in one of the central Philippine island of Samar in 1902, the 9th Infantry waged, it was an officer named Smith who very much exceeded his orders. He has told the regiment, he says, everybody over the age of 10 is a guerrilla and should be treated as such, and resulted in a lot of destruction to the communities, a lot of scorched earth tactics, literally, and massacres among the population. And when you consider you march into your typical Philippine village of the time and you start killing every male over the age of 10, that's a lot. That's a scar that in some ways has never fully healed on the island. And then, of course, the 9th Infantry took the bells from the church, Balangiga Church, that had been rung to warn the populace that the Americans were coming, and brought them home as war trophies. And then I think it was about 10 or 15 years ago, the Philippine government started asking for them back. And I think it was in 2017 or 2019 that the Army gave the bells back in a way to kind of reconcile and, if you will, atone for what had been done. I will say this, the Army at the time did hold Smith accountable. They did hold some other officers that were participated in the Samar massacre accountable. So they didn't people didn't go unpunished. But as you can tell, this is not, as we were talking earlier, this is not, story like Balangiga demonstrates this is not ancient history out there by any means.
Sure. A few audience members asked a very similar question, that they, as far as the war in the Pacific in general, they seem to see a lot of multi-volume and new work, popular and academic work on the Navy's role in the Pacific. And so a few of our audience members wants you to recommend some good overviews of the Army's role in the Pacific Theater.
John McManus has a 2-volume series that has just come out in the last couple of years about the Army in the Pacific, and it traces Army involvement all the way through. 1/3 of the United States Army fought in the Pacific. In fact, over half of the National Guard divisions that were mobilized in World War II fought in the Pacific. The Marines and Navy tend to seem to have better PR people, I guess, but the Army is very much there. The other one I would recommend actually are the Army Green Books. If you're looking at individual campaigns, the Army Green Books are very, very good on the Army's role in the campaign, or some of those campaign brochures that you can get on the CMH website. But yeah, John McManus is probably those 2 volumes are very readable, and they're probably the most modern ones out there going.
Right. And just as an FYI for the audience, the Army Green Books are a big series produced by the Center of Military History and its predecessors about the Army at all theaters. And if you go to history.army.mil under World War II resources, you'll find them free as PDFs. So that makes it pretty handy. Let's see. Let me get to a couple more here before we hang it up. Can you tell us a little bit about General Walter Kruger in the Philippines near the end of World War II?
Walter Kruger is, or as he would have said it, Walter Kruger, because most people don't realize he was actually born in Germany, and his family came over and settled in the United States. His father was a missionary. And Walter Kruger is a forgotten major player in the Pacific War. Commands 6th Army from 1943 to 45, and he is MacArthur's basically amphibious spearhead. He masterminds most of the New Guinea landings from Hollandia in April of 44 all the way to the end of the war. If the invasion of Japan had come in the fall of 45 with the southern island of Kyushu, Kruger was going to be the man. Kruger was the man who masterminded the landing at Leyte that brings MacArthur back to the Philippines. He's the one who masterminds the landing on Luzon and the campaign on Luzon in 45. Kruger is exactly 1 year younger than MacArthur. They share the same birthday, MacArthur 1880, Kruger 1881. He's a good balance for MacArthur. MacArthur would be frustrated with him sometimes because Kruger tended to be more methodical and a bit more cautious. Particularly, a good example of this is after the invasion in Luzon in 45. Kruger's army is expanding into the central Luzon plain, but he's got a significant force under Yamashita on his left flank in the hills. And so he's being cautious, and MacArthur's on him the whole time. Go to Manila, go to Manila. We have to get back to Manila. Part of that is the importance of the port, but part of it we should never forget. MacArthur had lived in Manila in 1941 and had left his home there. And so there is some of that. I want to get back home, but there is some of that. I want to free the prisoners, and we need to get there to the city before the Japanese destroy it. And so that becomes a bit of a sore point between the two of them. But MacArthur trusts Kruger. They make a good team in the sense that they balance each other very well. And the fact that MacArthur doesn't hold a grudge about that whole thing about Manila is the fact that Kruger was going to be masterminding the first landing, when the invasion of the Japanese home islands. But Kruger did himself a great disservice after the war, because when he wrote his memoirs, it reads like a battle report. He didn't give a lot of the personal. He was always a very private individual, and you get a sense of that. Sometimes it's one of those memoirs that what it doesn't say actually tells you sometimes more than what it actually says. But he, and then his counterpart at 8th Army, who wrote a very good memoir, Robert Eichelberger, deserve far more recognition than they have gotten.
Okay, I think we have time for one or two more here. One of our historians from Center of Military History has a question about can you talk about the legacy of Filipino veterans after World War II and their lengthy efforts to obtain veterans benefits from the U.S. government?
Ooh, yes. This is an answer in two parts, because if you're a Philippine scout, when the independence comes in 1946, you are given the option to stay in the Philippines, or you can take U.S. citizenship and come to the United States. And a lot of scouts, some scouts stay, some scouts come. In fact, the only Filipino Medal of Honor recipient, Jose Calugas, who was a Philippine scout, comes to the United States and settles in Washington State. And they, because they have always been in the United States Army, are entitled to full pension and benefits. If you're in the Philippine Army, which was you were originally recruited by the Philippine government and then brought into U.S. service in the summer of 1941, they had promised these benefits. And then at the end of the war, with independence, the United States, in an act that redounds not to the country's credit, basically told the Philippine government, we're going to renege on those promises, and here is a block grant for you to pay pensions and benefits. It wasn't enough. And so it's been a long fight. It's been an off and on fight. And I think it was 10 years ago, I think it was, Congress finally was appropriated some benefits and were able to extend benefits. Of course, by that point, you're talking 2009, and most of the veterans are either very old or not, or had passed by that point. But it's not a happy memory for an Army that ended up fighting very well and very hard on our side during the war.
Got it. Chris Kolakowski, Director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum. We thank you very much for being with us tonight. And we could not get to all the questions. Would it be okay if folks got in touch with you at the Wisconsin Veterans Museum if they want to follow up and get some answers to their questions?
Absolutely. I will put our website, if you don't mind, I'll put it in the chat here, and you can reach me through that.
All right, and I want to thank our audience members. And Jen, if we can see the last slide, we've got a book talk coming up very soon, May 20th, about by Kevin Weddle, who is a professor at the U.S. Army War College. And the book is called The Complete Victory, the Saratoga and the American Revolution. So it's a great book. I read it as soon as it came in. Wonderfully done by Oxford University Press. I also encourage you to check out Chris's publications as well that he mentioned earlier. And once again, thanks to the audience. Chris, when you make it down to the museum, you're entitled to a free lunch on me and as compensation. And if you bring your dad with you, I'll buy his lunch too. How about that?
I'll look forward to it, John. Thanks for having me tonight.
Okay. All right. Again, thanks to the folks who tuned in. We had a great crowd and excellent questions. Couldn't get to them all, but thanks again. And with that, good evening. And we're glad you were with us.